East of the Zagros Mountains, a plateau extends towards India. While Egypt was rising up against the Hyksos, a wave of herding tribes from the north of the Caspian Sea was descending into this area and crossing into India. When the Assyrians built their new empire, a second wave covered the entire stretch between the Zagros and the Hindu Kush. Some tribes settled, others maintained their semi-nomadic lifestyle. These were the Iranian peoples. Welcome to the Myths and Curiosities channel. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any notifications. Like all nomadic peoples without police and courts, a code of honor was central to Iranian tribes, and their religious beliefs differed from those of farmers. While the farmers of Egypt and Mesopotamia had converted the gods of nature into guardians of the city, the Iranians had begun to distill them into some universal principles. Zoroaster, who lived around 1000 BC, led this process. For him, the only God was the creator, Ahura Mazda, bearer of Asha, light, order, truth, the law or logic by which the world was structured. Even those who didn't practice Zoroastrians grew up shaped by a culture that valued simple ethical ideas, like telling the truth. In some areas, a tribe was able to gather a collection of other tribes under its leadership. Fears were one of those. They built a capital at Ecbatana, meeting place, in the east of Zagros, from which they extended their power. In 612 BC, Cyaxares, king of the Medes, invaded Nineveh with the Chaldeans, after which he pushed to the northwest. In 585 BC, the Medes were fighting the Lydians at the river Halys when a solar eclipse frightened both sides into making peace. Soon after, Cyaxares died, leaving a kind of empire to his son Astyages, 585 to 550 BC. One of the regions whose tribes paid tribute to the Medes was Persia, which lay southeast of Ecbatana beyond Elam. There were about 10 or 15 tribes in Persia, one of which was the Pasargadae. The leader of the Pasargadae always came from the Achaemenid clan, and in 559 BC, a new leader was chosen, Cyrus II, the Great. We are told that Cyrus was the grandson of Astyages on his mother's side, but that did not stop him from wanting to get rid of the yoke of fear. In 552 BC, he formed the Persian tribes into a federation and started a series of revolts. When the inevitable confrontation with his grandfather came in 550 BC, the Medes mutinied and joined Cyrus in marching on Ecbatana. Cyrus took the title of Shah, king of Persia, and built a capital at the site of his victory, which he named Pasargadae, in honor of his tribe. However, the conquest of the Medes landed Cyrus with a vague and extensive empire of countless different peoples. He faced cultural diversity, suspicion, and outright hostility. Lydia and Chaldean Babylon had agreements with the Medes. None of them were comfortable with a Persian takeover. Lydia was won because Cyrus didn't play by the rules. After an indecisive battle near the river Halys one autumn, King Croesus, 560 to 546 BC, returned to Sardis, hoping to resume fighting in the spring, as per custom. But Cyrus followed him home and captured Sardis itself, the capital of Lydia and the richest of the Ionian cities. A century earlier, Lydia had minted the first coins, making Ionia a center of commerce. Now all of that has fallen to Cyrus. As for Croesus himself, it appears that Cyrus spared his life, again against all precedent. Cyrus developed a reputation for sparing conquered rulers so he could ask their advice on how best to govern his lands. It is difficult to know how much of this reputation was secured, but before Cyrus, no one would have wanted it anyway. It would be a sign of weakness. Cyrus, on the other hand, saw cooperation as a strength, particularly when it came to securing the ultimate prize, Babylon. Instead of trying to take the greatest city in the world by force, Cyrus ran a propaganda campaign to exploit the unpopularity of its king, Nabonidus. Babylonian traditions would be safer with Cyrus, was the message. The gates were opened and palm fronds were placed before him as he entered the city. Once in Babylon, Cyrus performed the religious ceremonies that Nabonidus had neglected and returned the confiscated icons to his temples across the country. These acts allowed Cyrus to claim a legitimate government in Babylon, government sanctioned by the Babylonian gods. He then explained what place this would occupy in his empire. His would be an empire based, in effect, on a kind of contract between himself and the various peoples under your care. They would pay their tribute, and he would ensure that everyone was free to worship their own gods and live according to their customs. The exiled Jews were allowed to return home and were given money to build a new temple in Jerusalem. This earned Cyrus a brilliant article in the Old Testament, as well as providing him with a useful buffer state against Egypt. Cyrus' multiculturalism made lasting imperial peace finally a real possibility and defined the way in which later empires sought to achieve stable government. It was obvious to Cyrus that this was the only way he could hope to maintain his conquests, but his was a vision that only someone outside the River Valley civilizations, with their intense attachments to the local gods, could have conceived. Cyrus' son and successor Cambyses II, 529 to 522 BC, added Egypt to the Persian Empire, but then a revolt broke out at home, led, it seems, by a middling priest posing as Cambyses' brother, to whom Cambyses had secretly murdered. Cambyses ran back, but died on the way, leaving one of his generals, a distant relative, to intervene. His name was Darius. Darius I, the Great, killed the pretender to the throne, but revolts were now breaking out everywhere, and he found himself having to reinstate Cyrus' conquests. Backed by the army and noble clans of Persia, enriched by imperial rule, Darius regained the empire and extended it to the Indus Valley, an award worth several times more in tribute than Babylon. Darius realized that if the empire was to work, it needed efficient organization. He divided it into 20 satrapies, or provinces, each paying a fixed rate of tribute to Persia. Each satrapy was headed by a satrap, or centrally appointed governor, often related to Darius. To prevent the satrap from building a base of power, Darius appointed a separate military commander who was answerable only to him. Imperial spies known as the King's Ears kept track of both and reported to Darius via the postal service. The empire was connected by a network of roads along which messengers could change horses at space stations for a day's travel. Darius took much of this framework from the Assyrians, simply applying it on a larger scale, but his use of tribute was something new. Previously, the tribute was essentially protection money paid to avoid trouble, but Darius treated it as a tax. He used it to build a navy and embarked on massive public spending programs, pumping money into irrigation works, mineral exploration, roads, and a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea. He also established a common currency, which made working away from home much easier. Darius now assembled teams of artisans from across the empire to build, under the direction of Persian architects, an imperial capital at Persepolis. Here he could store his gold and silver in a giant vault, which soon became very small, and show the multi-ethnic scope of his empire. Persepolis became a showcase for the artistic styles of nearly every culture in the empire, kept in a Persian design frame. It was a visualization of Cyrus' idea of empire. But Darius never recognized Cyrus. He seems to have a chip in his shoulder about not belonging to Cyrus' branch of the Achaemenid clan. As he surpassed Cyrus' conquests, he began to behave in an increasingly exalted manner, exchanging the title of Shah for the greater Shahanshah, King of Kings. Like Persepolis, however, this flowed directly from Cyrus' vision. Cyrus had played the role of king of Babylon when he entered the city, but his concept of empire required a ruler who was above all kings linked to the interests of any community. It demanded a king of kings. Humiliation and decay. Darius' later rule saw problems in the Mediterranean. In 499 BC, there was a Greek revolt in Ionia. After finally nullifying it, Darius' fleet sailed to punish Athens for supporting the rebels, only to meet surprise defeat. If the Persian administrative machine didn't seem dangerously weak, the Greeks would have to learn a lesson. But when Darius raised taxes to fund a rearmament campaign, it sparked riots in more important areas, such as Egypt. It was up to Darius' son Xerxes I, 486 to 465 BC, to restore order in Egypt and address the Greek question. Xerxes carried himself even more haughty than Darius, and with two great empire builders to follow, he had even more to prove. But he lacked cultural sensitivity. When tax increases produced riots in Babylon in 482 BC, Xerxes sacked the city, destroyed the temple, and melted down the solid gold statue of Marduk, 3 times the size of a man. With her went the greatness of Babylon. Marduk's gold allowed Xerxes to begin gathering his forces to crush the Greeks in 480 BC. Forced to fight too soon, however, he suffered worse humiliation than his father. Thereafter, Xerxes appears to have largely retired to the luxury of his court and harem. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he had imitated the behavior of a Mesopotamian king for public consumption, but now the private lives of Persian rulers took on Mesopotamian form. Enclosed in opulent seclusion, the later Achaemenids played an increasingly gaudy pantomime of harem intrigue and palace assassination. The empire that Cyrus and Darius built was strong enough to withstand this fall into decay for 200 years, but it gradually took its toll. The satraps carved out their own islands of power. Inflation began to bite as taxes continued to rise. Even the empire's multiculturalism, initially its great strength, had its drawbacks. The huge army was a bewildering sack of troops, all trained and equipped according to their own traditions, all speaking different languages. In 401 BC, Cyrus the Younger, satrap of Lydia, Phrygia and Cappadocia, staged a coup against his brother Artaxerxes II, 404 to 358 BC, with the help of 10,000 Greek mercenaries who returned home when the coup failed. The information they brought paved the way for the triumphant arrival of Alexander the Great in 334 BC. Persia had been the first real empire, an empire with an organizational structure developed from a realistic idea of how to rule different subjugated peoples. He defined the role of an emperor and set a model for future empires, from the Romans to the British. When Alexander came to replace the dying Persian Empire with a vision of his own, he kept Cyrus' example in mind. Tell me in the comments what you think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, enjoy it now, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. See you in the next video.